Hi, this is Paul, and this is part of my Rough Draft for Sunday series where I walk through, as a practice run, the sermon that I'm going to preach this Sunday. And this Sunday is Palm Sunday, and I'm going to begin by playing this little selective attention test that those of you who are watching this channel because you've watched Jordan Peterson videos, you're already well aware of. And you're aware that the point is that we don't see a lot. And in fact, we miss a lot of things. And this is very true, especially of a holiday like Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday for preachers poses a special challenge because the story is really fairly simple and clear. Not always as clear as we imagine. One of the things that I like to do often, if I want to get an idea of the zeitgeist, which is kind of the spirit of the age, is I go to Google and I'll do an image search on something. And so these are the things that come up for Palm Sunday, where you have palms and you've got some Sunday school pictures of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey or something from a movie. And so what we know about Palm Sunday and what people identify with Palm Sunday are waving these palms. And so this is the story. And this year we're telling it out of Mark. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'What are you doing?' say, 'The Lord needs it, and he will send it back here shortly.'" Then they found a colt outside in the street, tied to a doorway. As they tied it, some people standing there asked, "What are you doing untying that colt?" They answered as Jesus had told them, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus, and they threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now, this is one of four tellings of this Sunday that you'll find in the Gospels. And this is Mark's telling. Now, Mark has a special one of the things that we do as preachers is, especially with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we compare the wording of them. And one of the things that you can see is if you line them side by side, you'll see, oh, well, this is interesting. They kind of follow the same story. There are some interesting details at the end in terms of what's happening, which day, how it goes. But you'll also find word selection differences. One of the things you might notice that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's no mention of palms. They get mentioned in John. And so what we tend to do is we tend to take all the different elements of it and put it together in kind of a mental composite picture, and that's what gets acted out on Palm Sunday. Now, what people who have studied the Bible have known for a long time is that there's an interesting relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Here, Mark is in the center, Matthew is over on this side, and Luke is on this side. And everything with this particular kind of reddish color comes from Mark. And you can see that the gray here, at least in this chart, is found nowhere else. So gray stuff here is unique to Matthew. Gray stuff here is unique to Luke. And then there's stuff that's common in Matthew and Luke, and that isn't in Mark. And this has led to the supposition by many people that Luke, for example, when he starts his gospel, says that he gathered together sources, that Mark was one of the sources, and that what's often called Q or source is the other source, the source that Matthew and Luke had in common, and then we assume Luke perhaps had sources other than those two sources that he accumulated into his book. And even though the Gospel of Matthew doesn't say so, the assumption is that the author of the Gospel of Matthew did similar things. Now, Christian tradition has held that the Gospel of Mark, that the Mark who wrote the Gospel of Mark was a disciple of Peter. And so Mark wrote this gospel based on the stories and the preaching that Peter would do. And so he wrote it down, and then it's shared and used by the other two. Now in our sermon series, we've been talking about covenant, and covenant tries to bridge this communication gulf that we have between ourselves and God. If you consider the kind of being that would be responsible for the creation of the rich, deep, and enormously complex universe that we live in, how could that being in fact communicate with us? And how could that being communicate with us in a substantive way and in a meaningful way and in ways that impact how we live our lives and what we do and what we do with ourselves? And part of what we have to face in this is that even through a text, we begin to recognize that, oh, we just read through this text, and then we saw the story, and we have the colt and the asking and he rides on it, and then they come in and they wave branches. What we begin to see is that in fact, even the telling of the story, we have this composite telling of the story that is filtered through, and that there's selection bias, there's awareness issues, there's all of these kinds of things. Never mind the fact that the text was written thousands of years ago, and that there's been almost nonstop conversation in the world about these texts ever since they were known, and on, and here we go, and we think, well, how on earth can God get through all this clutter? And then you have the church reality where churches are celebrating this Sunday, and we do so kind of to reenact the palm branches. And some churches that are large and have lots of money, they might even bring in a donkey into the sanctuary. And this somehow is supposed to pull all the pieces together about how we and God can relate. Now, what often happens when you preach a sermon is you have your own attention issues that I can't talk about all of the text, or we would be here all day. In fact, in any given text like this, we could go a very long time talking about it. There is no other book in all of human history that has been as studied as the Bible, that has been as talked about as the Bible, has been as dissected as the Bible. And many of you who don't sit in a study and open up books about a passage are not aware of all that we could go into with respect to this passage. But in the context of this creator God trying to connect with a rebellious world, one of the details I'd like to focus on this morning is the unridden colt. And in fact, this is kind of an interesting, tiny little tidbit, which is actually a really big deal in terms of the conversation that we're having. Because the question is, how can this creator God connect with this rebellious world? And so one of the elements that we have to deal with in this conversation is wildness or chaos. And what's fascinating about this, so as with all these modern tools, contemporary tools that we have to study the Bible, this is a little screen capture from my Bible study software. You find this little footnote after the English translation, which no one has ever written, and if you mouse over it, it gives 3 references. One to Numbers 19, one to Deuteronomy 21, and one to 1 Samuel 6:7. Now, in the interest of time, I won't go into all 3 passages, but they're all very interesting passages. The Deuteronomy 21 passage is a passage that details how a town can make atonement for an unsolved murder. And those are what the editors put in on top of the English Bible to help us understand it. If someone is slain, lying in a field in the land the Lord your God is giving you, now right there, that selection of the language, God is contextualizing his entire land that he's laying claim to. And now someone has been murdered and nobody knows, well, it's probably not true that nobody knows who did it. Someone knows who did it. God knows who did it, but it's an unsolved murder and you can't figure it out. And so the idea is that something here has happened. The way the world should be has been violated. If you go back over the number of the sermons, the covenant that happened at the end of Noah is God said, all of the bloodshed that has happened in this world, I'd like it to stop. God rescues Noah, but then establishes a covenant and says, look, I'll maintain the firmament if you stop killing each other. Well, we haven't stopped killing each other. In fact, killing each other continues. And here's a case where someone has been murdered and nobody wants to fess up. And so what should a town do? And in a sense, what God is saying is that this town is responsible for the individual. This town is responsible for this murder. And how will this town be able to stand before God and give an account for themselves if, in fact, someone has been murdered and nobody is fessing up and they can't solve the crime? Well, your elders and your judges shall go out and measure the distance from the body to the neighboring towns. Find the closest town. The elders of the town nearest the body shall take a heifer that has never been worked and never worn a yoke, and lead it down into a valley that has not been plowed or planted, and where there is a flowing stream. There in the valley they are to break the heifer's neck. Now this gets into this entire picture that we've kind of been looking at, the relationship between the people's lives and the animals' lives. And again we see that when people don't do what's right, the animals suffer. And so here this heifer takes the blow for the town. It's a substitution. And now what's really interesting is that this heifer needs to be, he's not wild, he's domesticated, but he's a borderline animal. And where he's never been broken. Well, what does that mean? Now, most of us are city dwellers and we're not accustomed to this, but if you've ever had a cat or a dog that you have to train, you recognize that there's a certain degree of wildness even in this domesticated animal that you must take out of him. And so it's interesting that you take this heifer that's never been yoked and you take it to a field that isn't plowed, where there's a stream running through it. In a sense, you're passing from civilization out into chaos, out into nature, and here the execution must happen. Well, that's really fascinating. Why? What's the deal with the wildness in the world and God's claim over it and our paying and our paying attention to this wildness? What's the relationship? It brings to mind C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia and the talk about Aslan and the children wondering, is he safe? And no, he's not safe. Is he wild? Well, he's kind of wild. If you think of wild as being not in control of itself, Aslan is fully in control of himself, but he's not tame. He's not subjugated by us. And so this heifer that has not been subjugated goes into a land which is in a sense not subjugated by us, and that heifer takes the blow. Similar thing happens, or an interesting thing happens in 1 Samuel 6, where the Philistines have to get the Ark of the Covenant back to Israel because it's bringing disease and chaos and destruction, and so they thought they could take it as a trophy of their victory over Israel. Now they just want to get rid of it. And so here they're given instructions. Now then get a new cart with 2 cows that have calved and have never been yoked. So here again, the calves are kind of in this liminal space between chaos or wilderness and between civilization, and hitch the cows to the cart, but take their calves away and pen them up. Now, the natural thing to happen would be that you could barely get these cows yoked in order to pull a cart. They've not been trained to pull a cart. There's no expectation there's every expectation that these 2 cows, even with a rider, would likely be unable to take a cart, at least without a great deal of effort, because they've never been broken. And then they've got this desire to go back to their calves because they've just given birth. But then, of course, it's these 2 calves, or these 2 cows, that then take the ark of the Lord and put it on the cart, and the chest beside it, put the golden objects, these are the offerings that they're giving them, and let it go. And they took the 2 cows and hitched them to the cart, and then the cows go lowing happily to the Israelite town. And so the Philistines very instinctively understand that this is God's doing. This is wild. This is someone who has power over the wilderness. Now what's interesting is that Jesus, again, is going into Jerusalem, and this has great symbolic meaning. Jerusalem just isn't any other city. This is the city that hosts the temple that is, in a sense, the embassy, the sub-temple to the great temple above the sky where the ruler of the world resides. And Israel isn't just another people, it's his chosen people. And the donkey isn't just another conveyance. These are the mounts of the kings of Israel. David rides the donkeys, and Solomon rides the donkeys, and so Jesus is sitting in their place. And so this Palm Sunday passage is just simply rich with meaning, symbolic meaning that connects it to how many different Old Testament passages, which gives us preachers something different to talk about every year as we have to go through the passage. We talk about the Psalms association with the Hosanna. We talk about the Zechariah association. We talk about all of this. But notice again how Luke frames it, and only Luke. He has peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And that is a contrast to the birth story where the shepherds are out in the field and the angels are singing peace on earth and goodwill towards men. So the shepherds hear from the angels peace on earth, which is a way of blessing, a way of expressing blessing. It's a greeting, as it were. And now earth in Palm Sunday, in the reception of Jesus to Jerusalem, responds to heaven. And it's the embodiment of heaven and earth being set right, and the kingdom of God coming, where the blessings that heaven gives earth are now reciprocated by us and given back towards heaven. But what's interesting is that although this passage is rich with the symbolic, it's also rich with this idea of God and Jesus as the ruler of creation. And a little bit later, in at least Luke's account, the Pharisees rebuke Jesus and say, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." And Jesus says, if they cry out, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. Now, stones don't cry out. Stones don't talk. Stones are there. But Jesus is saying that what is happening now is of such significance that nature herself would respond if the people who are, per the Genesis story, the stewards, the viceroys of earth, we are the ones who have language. We are the ones who are supposed to verbally respond to heaven. We are the ones who are supposed to act on behalf of God to the earth, and we are the ones that are supposed to speak on behalf of the earth to heaven. And so Jesus says, if the children and if my followers didn't cry out, the stones would cry. Well, what stones are these? Well, these are actually the stones of the temple. That the entire cosmos, from the inanimate stuff, would find voice. And the Logos, who is Christ, as we see from the beginning of John, the Logos would be received by Logos, would be received by speech. And then actually after this, Jesus makes the comment, and he weeps over Jerusalem, that not one stone will be left on another. And this is a prophecy about the destruction of the temple. Now what's amazing about this is that this picture that we have from, now where is the temptation? See, this is why I practice, because what I realized when I was going through this is that I wanted to make a point about the Gospel of Mark and the wild animals. And I was waiting for that slide to come up, and I didn't see it come up because I failed to put it in. Well, it's interesting in the Gospel of Mark that, for example, when you look at the temptations story, which you can find in Matthew and Mark and Luke, the shortest version is in Mark, but one of the things that Mark decides to include is that, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, again, the symbolic meaning of 40 days, being tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild animals. Luke doesn't see fit to include this. Matthew doesn't see fit to include this, but Mark, the gospel that has Jesus fighting Satan and Jesus encountering the forces of chaos and evil, and Jesus' mastery over creation. When Jesus is in the wilderness, he's there with the wild animals. And this is a picture of, well, pre-lapsarian creation. This is a picture of Jesus with the wild animals. And for you Jordan Peterson people, if you look at Jonathan Peugeot, Jonathan will work this imagery. Jesus and the wild animals. And this is where you have the sense of the lion and the lamb both bow before him. And Jesus here in this space, just like we saw in the Old Testament with these stories, Jesus here in this space. So when he rides the colt, the one that has never been ridden, now any of you out there who work with horses and break animals for human service know that animals need to be broken, animals need to be trained. Well, Jesus doesn't train this animal. It's not his animal. And the entire story, there's lots of layers to that story where, it's almost kind of like a Jedi mind trick. This is not, the master has need of this colt. Jesus is master in this. And Jesus is being received as he truly is, now recognized by the great city of Jerusalem. And so this is in many ways, well, this is a triumphal entry. And again, many of us in our culture don't understand this, but anyone in the Roman Empire would have understood what a triumph is. It is when the great general comes back to the capital after defeating the enemies, after a victory. Now we jump ahead. I think the person that probably articulated this best was C.S. Lewis in his book In Miracles, where he talks about miracles of the new creation. And he talks about walking on water, for example. In the walking on water, we see the relations of spirit and nature so altered that nature can be made to do whatever spirit pleases. And this Lewis intimates, and I think the Bible intimates, is that, this is what happens in the fall, that we rebel against God and nature does likewise against us. And so here with creation restored, nature is once again the servant of the steward who is in perfect obedience to the master. And so when Jesus is received, nature receives Jesus as her master. And so Jesus' miracles are not violations of nature, but actually the subjugation of nature, but the willing subjugation of nature, where nature recognizes its author, recognizes its master, and humbly and happily serves its master. And so in the walking on water, we see the relationship of spirit and nature so altered that nature can be made to do whatever spirit pleases. This new obedience of nature is, of course, not to be separated, even in thought, from the Spirit's own obedience to the Father of spirits. Apart from that proviso, such obedience by nature, if it were possible, would result in chaos. Now in terms of my Jordan Peterson conversations, this is the monarchical vision. The evil dream of magic arises from finite spirits longing to get that power without paying the price. The evil reality of lawless applied science, which is magic's son and heir. Now go back and look at alchemy and Newton, and Newton. Anyway, this probably won't be in the sermon. Not when I mean alchemy and Newton and all the Jordan Peterson talk, although you can probably see that there's stuff behind here in this. I do not know how radically nature herself, evil reality of lawless applied science, which is magic's son and heir, is actually reducing large tracts of nature to disorder and sterility at this very moment. I do not know how radically nature herself would need to be altered to make her thus obedient to spirits, when spirits have become wholly obedient to their source. One thing at least we must observe. If we are in fact spirits, not nature's offspring, then then there must be some point, probably the brain, at which created spirit even now can produce effects on matter, not by manipulation or techniques, but simply by the wish to do so. If that was what was meant by magic, then magic is a reality manifested every day, every time you move your hand or think a thought. And nature, as we have seen, is not destroyed, but rather perfected by her servitude. And so Lewis's thought here, and that what we see on Palm Sunday, is that Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem as master of, in a sense, momentarily, within that little glimpse, renewed perfect relationship, renewed perfected creation. The people rejoice. The colt obeys. The skeptics say, shut the crowd up. And Jesus says, if they were shut up, the stones would give praise. The temple itself would speak what must be spoken. So the King of creation comes. His miracles declare him the King of creation, and everyone knew it. We want creation, however, and we don't want its king. And this is the story of the Garden of Eden. We want to be kings of creation. And in fact, though, part of the calamity of our stewardship of creation is in fact our own division, because we are not together under the great king. We are divided, and so it's the clash of all of these visions that creates the turmoil and the suffering and the chaos that we unleash. So just like in Genesis, God doesn't destroy, Jesus doesn't in that moment destroy anyone who stands against him. He in fact tolerates them. And in fact what will come, because those of you who understand Palm Sunday, Good Friday, Easter, what will come is that some in this crowd who are at least watching and perhaps cheering, come the end of the week, will at least watch and perhaps cry out, crucify him. And this is our story. This is how we are. This time, he will face a political execution. He will be killed by empire. And I don't have time to go into that, but that right there is how the Bible tells the story, all the tensions between our rebellion against God and God's tolerance of our rebellion, yet God's slow, patient work, as we talked about in the sermon last week, to bring our wills, to bring us to this place where this Jeremiah vision of all of us knowing the Lord and of creation being set right. And again, you can go back and read Jeremiah 31 and see this vision of life as it's supposed to be. And that vision, of course, in Jeremiah 31, told within the perspective of the cultural setting at which the prophecy is given. Well, what drives us to rebellion? What drives us to refuse to worship? We are tiny little pretentious beings demanding that we be the center of the universe and the main character of the story. And the truth is, we are not. We cannot be. We are simply what we are, and we were made to be part of a far larger story, and something deep inside of us knows that to be true. So then Jesus, in this symbolic moment, reveals himself fully publicly. Now this is very interesting, because in the story of the temptations, Satan tempts him to throw himself down from the pinnacle of the temple, and all of the people will see him. But what's interesting is that in some ways, this story is the reverse of that, where Jesus, in fact, reveals himself, and he reveals himself with riding the untamed colt. And he is revealed, and he is worshipped by the crowd that is celebrating, and the words of the psalmist that they use, which has, I didn't go into that in this telling, which has tremendous significance in terms of the coming of David and the restoration of God's kingdom, and all of that comes into being. So in a sense, this is Jesus revealing himself, but the revelation of him elicits the kind of response we would expect from a sinful world. And what's interesting here is that rebellion is led and spoken by the religious leaders. And this is something that preachers and pastors and Christians should take deeply seriously. That it was not the case that when Jesus arrived, all the Pharisees and the observant of his community, would stand with him against the Romans and the pagans. Those, of course, were the culture war lines that everyone understood and saw in that day. But Jesus, in a strange way, transcends this culture war, and every side hates him. And just this group of people, including the donkey, comes to obey and to worship. But that will be a decided minority that at the end of the week will be driven into hiding while the political and religious powers that be take hold and crucify him, which again will yield more revelation. So he must receive his proper place, otherwise the stones of the temple will cry out. The rebellion is on full display too, and this is always what happens with revelation. That when the curtain is pulled back and we see God, our truest nature inside of us rebels and we say, no, I must be king of the world. I must be king of creation if I have to subject it with blows. I must be in charge. And that then is the story of the world. All of us fighting for control. We expect angel armies to put down the rebellion. In a mini apocalypse. Now remember, revelation is Greek for revelation is apocalypse, or rather English for Greek apocalypse is kind of like revelation or revealing. The imperial Roman armies will put down Jesus' hoaxed rebellion. Sorry, I got a phone call. We expect angel armies to put down the rebellion. We expect that, but what happens is, in fact, that imperial Roman armies will put Jesus to death. And so we say, well, who's really on top? And if you followed my Ezekiel conversations, you know that this is in a sense a redux of what's happening in Ezekiel, where the script is changed. And those who should be his subjects show their begrudging loyalty to Rome, but also reveal their true loyalty, which is really only to themselves. And not Mark, but Matthew and John will move this point much further when the crowds will say, we have no king but Caesar. And in reality, what they're saying is, we have no king but ourselves. I have no king but me. I do not want to obey this God. I do not want to obey this man. I will rebel against him. And nature comes up and rebels against us and says, oh, you little center of the universe who has this story in your head that imagines that the entirety of creation revolves around you. Your body will break down in the age of decay. You will be subject to cold and to rain and to influenza and to how many viruses and things, and you will die. You are not center of the universe. And we have no moral high ground over them because we are just like they are. So what will we do with this? Will you bring your proper worship to creation's king? Now we imagine, and you say, well, will we bring proper worship? And what does that mean in terms of church? Should I go to church? Well, how do you expect to worship him? Well, I can worship him from home. Good. You should worship him at home. You should worship him with personal devotions. You should worship him by prayer. You should worship him with songs. But part of the reason that we come together for worship is we worship him as a people. In a sense, as the crowd that gathered on that Palm Sunday, that rightly worshiped. And I sometimes think if we don't worship him, the stones will cry out. And what happens when we worship is that we begin to replay this Palm Sunday. So we began looking at, well, we're very selective watchers. We miss things. We don't see things. And in fact, the truth is I've seen that video a number of times, so I can't not see the gorilla who comes and beats his chest. And I miss counting the basketball because I'm looking for the gorilla. Well, what should we be looking for on Palm Sunday? And if we believe this is true, what does that mean in terms of our action? Should we worship this God? Should we come together with others and give him our gifts and give him our praise? And if we don't, what does this reveal about our hearts? And then we have to ask ourselves the bigger question, will we in fact be obedient? Because worship is, in a sense, something we formally do. And let's say we go to church and we gather with the saints and we give our praises and we pray our prayers and we give our offerings and we listen to what the great King has to address us with. But worship should be 24/7. We should worship him as we work. We should worship him as we speak. In fact, all of our words, all of our actions, everything we do should be in alignment with him, which is exactly the picture of this, of recreation, where the donkey obeys, gladly, willingly receives his master, and if the people themselves wouldn't shout, the stones in the temple would cry out. So how should we respond? What should we do?